brief history of horror cinema and my top 5 favorites of all time. Welcome to the Top 5 Media channel. I've been running a whole horror series lately, from the classics to the modern greats, my personal favorites to horror comedies and underrated gems, so I thought I would do my first longer video on that very subject, as it's a genre I love. But first, if you wouldn't mind subscribing below, that would be great, as it would really help me out. I'm not sure the horror genre gets the same level of praise that other film genres do. You rarely find a horror movie being nominated for Best Picture, although a few have, and Silence of the Lambs won the Big Five in 1992, including Best Picture, although I would personally consider it more of a thriller than a true horror. But what a great film it was, though. And yet, horror movies have pretty much been around for as long as cinema itself. The French film The House of the Devil from 1896 is considered the first of the genre. There were many early horror films during the 1910s and 20s, but it really took off in 1931 with the release of Universal Pictures' Dracula with Bela Lugosi as the titular character. Did you know, amazingly, despite being so synonymous with the role, he actually only played Dracula twice on film, and one of those was in a comedy with Abbott and Costello. Even though being released during the height of the Great Depression, Dracula was a great box office success and started what would, these days certainly, have been described as a cinematic universe. With Frankenstein a few months later, with Boris Karloff as the monster, and then The Mummy, The Invisible Man, The Wolfman, various sequels and even comedy crossovers with the aforementioned Abbott and Costello. Several films followed, but, for me, the next big leap for horror came across the Atlantic, from Britain's Hammer Films, starting in the 1950s. I've always been interested to know how popular these films were abroad, especially in the United States, but I grew up loving these in the UK, and especially their takes on Dracula and Frankenstein with the great Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. Personally, I think the 1930s Universal output, although great, are a little hard to watch these days. But for me, the 1950s and 1960s production values increased massively, and especially as they are typically period pieces and often in color, still really enjoyable and accessible. The Hammer Film Studio started their horror output in 1955 with The Quatermass Experiment, followed by X the Unknown and Quatermass 2, but it was The Curse of Frankenstein when it really got interesting. This was their first color horror film, which exacerbated the level of gore with its bright red blood, and, believe it or not, it was unsure whether even an X-rated certificate would be granted. But it was, and the film was an enormous success. Dracula, known as Horror of Dracula in the US, quickly followed, along with The Mummy, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, The Curse of the Werewolf, The Phantom of the Opera, and several others, including many sequels. Too many to mention, but one that I loved growing up, that was a little different to the others, was The Nanny with Bette Davis, which almost got into my top 5 underrated horror movies short. Although not a Hammer horror, one movie that did get into that short was The Day of the Triffids from 1963, which tells the story of a man who wakes up after a night in hospital with his eyes bandaged after an operation to find that a meteor shower has blinded almost everyone else and the world is in chaos. If that sounds somewhat familiar, the idea and one of the early scenes of the protagonist walking through London inspired the 2002 film 28 Days Later and, to a lesser degree, the beginning of The Walking Dead. If you love hidden gems like this, I've got a top 5 on underrated horror movies you may have missed short. I'll link it here. Along with Cushing and Lee, another of my favorite actors of this period was Vincent Price, with his amazing and well-known voice, whose career in horror took off around the same time as Hammer horror in the 1950s, with The Fly, House of Wax, House on Haunted Hill.
I think everyone wonders what they would do if they saw a ghost.
And of course, his collaboration with Roger Corman in the latter series of Edgar Allan Poe productions. The House of Usher being my favorite. He even provided his voice to a Scooby-Doo series in 1985.
You can return the demons to the chest.
What's your favorite horror era or subgenre? Classic, slasher, modern, or something else? Let me know below. Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960 brought serial killers into wider use within the horror genre with the iconic shower scene, arguably making Norman Bates one of cinema's first slashers. And nearer the end of the decade, Rosemary's Baby had a huge influence on future occult-driven movies. Amazingly, neither of these made it into any of my top 5 lists.
What have you done to its eyes?
Some that did, though, came from the following decade, the 1970s. One of my all-time favorite horror movies, which inspired countless others, along with sequels of its own, was 1973's The Exorcist. I think it was partly the use of religious figures and beliefs that heightened the fear factor and made this and The Omen, my all-time favorite, so scary. For the time, especially, some of the special effects in both films were really very good too. Both films were nominated for Oscars, including Best Picture for The Exorcist, which won Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Sound. And Jerry Goldsmith won his only Oscar out of a total 18 nominations for Best Original Score for The Omen. Another of my top 5 favorites was Jaws. Quite a game changer for the genre at the time, especially as it became the first summer blockbuster and, at the time, the highest grossing film in history. Whilst considered more a thriller than a horror by many, remember it did cause a widespread increased fear of sharks when released and actually had an impact on beach attendance for a while.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
The late 70s saw a plethora of great horror films: Carrie, Alien, Halloween, the Amityville Horror, to name but a few. But one, which I feel has been a little forgotten and also on my underrated horror short, is Richard Attenborough's Magic, with a fantastic performance by Anthony Hopkins. Of course, it is more a psychological drama about mental illness, as is often the case with horror movies, than an out-and-out horror, and although not the first film to use a ventriloquist dummy or a doll, etc., it certainly could have been inspiration for Chucky, Annabelle et al.
You'll never know how many people want to believe in magic.
The 1980s created, I suppose, their own Dracula and Frankenstein characters in the guise of the slasher killer, with Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Michael Myers from Halloween taking shape. Pun very much intended. And more than enough Stephen King adaptations were made. All pretty good, with The Shining leading the pack, although Cujo's rabid dog scared me the most. But it was another Steven Spielberg production that was my favorite of the decade, Poltergeist. There has been much speculation over who really directed this film. Credited to Tobe Hooper, Spielberg was contractually unable to direct whilst making E.T., but he certainly wrote the original story and produced the film. It certainly felt like a Spielberg film to me. Whoever did it, I loved it. Great cast, some good special effects, and a fantastic, scary story.
They're here.
The last film to mention from my top 5 favorite horrors was also from the 80s. Clive Barker's Hellraiser, based on his own book, The Hellbound Heart. Some amazing imagery in this film. I always thought the makeup special effects deserved more recognition. Pinhead was brilliant.
Tear your soul apart.
Whilst it's had its peaks and troughs, the horror genre has gone from strength to strength in recent years, with the Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer franchises continuing the slasher tropes, the found footage subgenre being found with Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity, and the torture horror of Hostel, Wolf Creek, and Saw. In fact, the latter's James Wan and Lee Wannell have created some great movies in recent years between them. Insidious, The Conjuring Universe, Megan, The Invisible Man, and Wolfman. But we can see from those last two, and along with Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, that some monsters have been around a while and will most likely never die. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief history of horror movies and my personal favorites of the genre. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next Top 5.